join me in welcoming Dr. Olly Ayers.
What I want to do though is start with a photo. And I want you to take a look and tell me what you see.
I have a dream.
I have a dream. Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech 2 hours after this was taken. This is from the 28th of August 1963. This is a photo of the March on Washington movement. One of the most famous moments in this history we're talking about. This gentleman here, Martin Luther King. Now what I want to know, having said how famous and important this is can anyone here name anyone else in this photo apart from Martin Luther King? The reason I think this is a useful place to start our discussion is it shows us how skewed our understanding of what the civil rights movement is. We still think of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King being essentially synonymous, one and the same thing. This is the man with the dream, this is the man who led the movement. But actually, if we think about what's going on here, instantly it tells us there's something bigger going on. King was part of a much wider movement. So, to kind of cut a long, complicated story short, over the last 20, 30 years, historians like myself who study the past for a living, get paid to try and work out what's going on here, have been trying to broaden our understanding, trying to talk about some of these other individuals and the organisations it represented, and starting to try and think about the role of King in more detail. So that's hopefully a kind of starting point to some things I want to talk about in the next half hour, 40 minutes or so. Philip Randolph was the man who first had the idea for a march on Washington. Not in 1963, but in 1941. And just like in 1963, the movement wasn't just about King, in 1941, it wasn't just about Philip Randolph. Philip Randolph, very interesting, important, charismatic man. He was a socialist, trade unionist, a staunch believer in the importance of unionisation. But the movement he led was part of something bigger. So there's a moment in American history, in the build-up to when America enters the war, it's a moment of political opportunity. It's increasingly likely that the US is going to join the conflict in Europe and the conflict in the Pacific. For African Americans, they're not sitting idly by and kind of waiting for Martin Luther King to rock up 15 years later. They're trying to seize on a moment of political opportunity. A moment where America is actively having to rally its citizenry to this patriotic cause, and they're saying, yes, we agree with these American principles, democracy and freedom. But if we're going to fight in this war, you better start applying those very same principles on an ethical basis at home. So I'm showing you here a picture of a guidebook for one of the first kind of guidebooks for people who own motor cars. As we know, the 1920s is famous, the roaring 20s, the jazz age, the era of the Great Gatsby. That's all my students kind of like to tell me all the time. This is when people started buying and owning motor cars in large numbers. Of course, if you can do that, you need a guidebook. And this guidebook to the upper part of Manhattan is particularly illuminating as to how this part of the city had changed. This area, clustered around 125th Street, northern part of Manhattan, listed in the Automobile Blue Book as Little Africa. Little Africa. One of many symbols we could put up here that show how this area is completely transformed in the space of 2 decades. It's important here, and this is the bit where I unashamedly plug my book, is that the city itself, its physical environment, its urban geography, shapes history. In other words, it's not just, the city doesn't become just a passive backdrop. There's something about the layout of these places which shapes civil rights. There's the book. It's a history of black civil rights in New York City and Detroit during the New Deal and Second World War. And one of the things I argue in that is that if we want to understand civil rights, we need to go back earlier, we need to go north, and we need to start thinking about the layout of these places. Look at the famous grid pattern of the American city here. I guess we're all kind of familiar with this, lots of us probably been to America. We're familiar with this kind of classic layout of the American city. Think for a moment about how that might actually profoundly affect political expression. Politics, of course, as you know, isn't something which just happens at the top in national elections by elected politicians. It is also something which happens, what we might call at the grassroots, at the city level. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. This is an unknown street corner orator. Can you see what he's standing on? A step ladder, a rickety old wooden step ladder. This is entirely typical of the type of political life we find in places like Harlem between the two world wars. Someone pitching up on a street corner and basically bringing in passers-by to tell them his message. You can see how the spaces of the city itself give an opportunity for protest, an opportunity for organising, that in some ways is quite different to the predominantly rural world of somewhere like the Mississippi Delta. Marcus Garvey, on the one hand, therefore, shares some elements of the same history with Martin Luther King. He's part of a similar tradition on one level. On the other hand, he actually is advocating something quite different. So we all know from King's I Have a Dream speech, it's seen as being a dream of a colourblind future. A dream where skin colour, racial difference don't matter. Garvey's take on it, and he wasn't the only one to reach this conclusion, is that racial differences absolutely did matter, and that the way racial inequalities would be solved would be through an appeal to racial solidarity. So Garvey's message was a nationalistic message based on racial pride, an assertive promotion of blackness, and in some ways a rejection of integration. He was also an entrepreneur and wanted to use the strategy not just as a kind of abstract philosophical concern, but as a way of making money. So one of his most famous ventures was to set up an all-black shipping company called the Black Star Line. You're all familiar with the White Star Line, the company that built and associated with the Titanic. He said, no, we haven't had enough of the White Star Line, we're going to set up the Black Star Line. So it had an entrepreneurial and economic element as well. And it was also a vision, and I mentioned this a moment ago, and I want to dwell on this in the second half of my talk. It was also a vision which, on the one hand, yes, was focused on the local world of places like Harlem, but which also conceived of this problem of racial inequality as an international phenomenon. There's one big constituency, though, that's been almost entirely missing so far. And again, this is where this photo of this day is a kind of useful metaphor for us as historians as to how we should see the movement. But what is the big group almost entirely absent from the talk so far? Women. Where are the women? I've been talking about men. Where are the women? Is it that they weren't interested in this problem of racial equality? Is it that they weren't actively engaged in trying to challenge it? Absolutely not. Same photo from a different angle. Here are the women. Quite literally pushed to one side. We're going to fully understand what the civil rights movement was about, therefore. Not only do we need to start going beyond King, there's John Lewis, by the way, we also need to start thinking about some of these hidden actors, in particular the role of women, and how they fit within this history. Ella Baker, born 1903 in the South, Virginia, university educated, went to Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, was one of the millions of African Americans who left life in the segregated South and travelled north in search of a more equal and just life. So in the 1930s, she was one of the many African Americans who lived in Harlem. And like the many of African Americans who lived in Harlem in this period, she realised very quickly that racial injustices were very much alive and well in Harlem and other northern cities. One of the many interesting things she did in 1935, she had some work as a journalist, and she did an undercover expose for the big black newspaper in 1930s Harlem called the Amsterdam News, exposing what she rightly termed the Bronx slave market. Think about the 1930s just quickly. What do we know about that decade? Period of deep and stubbornly persistent economic recession. A time where the brunt of that economic recession fell hardest on those at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. And one of the many things that meant for African American women, this was a particularly desperate time. Excluded from many lines of work, one of the few places they could find some employment was in being in domestic service, so being a cleaner or a nanny or such like. And one of the things that happened in the 1930s was that comparatively wealthy and overwhelmingly white employers who wanted some occasional help would use their superior economic and racial status to exploit these women. So one of the things that Baker was interested in was what she termed the Bronx slave market, where each day African American women seeking work as domestics would go to a set of street corners in the Bronx and be offered work. Fast forward 20 years. 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks, the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to move out of her seat when ordered. Very famous moment, which I'm sure lots of you are aware of, the moment which precipitates what we know as the classic phase of the modern civil rights movement. It was Martin Luther King, an obscure Baptist preacher who hadn't really been in Montgomery that long at all, who was chosen to lead the new protest movement formed to boycott the buses. What did King and his advisors do? They called Ella Baker. They called Ella Baker. It was Ella Baker who flew from New York into Atlanta, who actually ran King's office for the first 3 years of the movement. Another famous quote. 1968, a few months after King's tragic assassination in Memphis, Ella Baker was asked to summarise what she thought the contribution of Martin Luther King to the movement was. And she said something very thought-provoking that I wanted to share with you and get you to consider. She said, to be honest, the movement made Martin, rather than Martin making the movement. This is not a discredit to him. This is, to me, as it should be. That's what Ella Baker is asking us to consider. Cuts back to the first photo we looked at. King is just part of something much wider and something much deeper. So one of the questions therefore becomes, well, if it's not all about King, clearly King is still important. And let me be really clear about this. I'm in no way trying to traduce the memory of King or say he was unimportant in any way. What I am asking us to kind of consider is how he fits within this much bigger, more interesting, longer story. He holds a mirror up to white America. It says, right, these are your values, not my values, these are your values. Democracy, freedom, equality, the right to protest, the right to equal justice under the law. It says, not my values, your values. Do you believe in those values or not? This is King's great political skill, and it's there right from the beginning, right at the moment he assumes this, in some ways, unwanted leadership position in the movement. Historians are starting to uncover the ways in which events in America to do with civil rights actually have an effect across the world. It's not just a one-way process. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. You can see how I like to do this by now. Another photo. Again, a little challenge for you. Anyone got any ideas where, when that might have been taken? Pardon?
Trafalgar Square?
Yeah, what makes you think it might be Trafalgar Square?
Lion.
The big line. Absolutely right. Trafalgar Square, the heart of Imperial London. Black woman standing up and letting, you can't hear what she's saying, but she's letting the crowd have it. Who is that? That's Amy Ashwood Garvey. It's Marcus Garvey's first wife. I won't give you the details of how their marriage ended spectacularly badly, They weren't married for long. Nonetheless, even though they might have been personally estranged by the 1930s when this was taken, but politically, they still had lots in common. 1935 is the year that Italy invaded Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as they called it. Often overlooked in histories of the world, certainly overlooked in histories of civil rights, but actually a really important moment in this history. A moment where protesters like Amy Ashford Garvey loudly and angrily made the point that all of these problems of imperialism, fighting colonialism, fighting fascism, fighting racism, were in some ways connected. This is Leary Constantine, one of the most famous, probably the most famous black man in Britain in the 1930s. West Indian cricketer from Trinidad, an all-rounder, made his name on a couple of West Indies tours to the UK in the late 1920s and 1930s, ended up playing club cricket in Lancashire. He sent his daughter to the local school, and here he is playing for the staff team. A really interesting and important character in the story, and a final example of how this history is international. So Constantine from Trinidad, making a living as a pro cricketer in Lancashire in the 1930s, then war breaks out. Constantine, like many others, contributes to that war effort, and what he does is something quite interesting. He takes a job for the Ministry of Labour. The Ministry of Labour are responsible for making sure there are enough people to fill the factories and produce all the material for the British war effort. One of the ways the British government do that, and this is often kind of left out of accounts of the war, is by importing labour from overseas, and in particular from its Caribbean colonies. So Constantine is recruited to help the Ministry of Labour organise that process. So he works in the northwest, based in Liverpool. In 1943, Constantine is still playing cricket. In 1943, he comes down to London for the day. He had been invited to play a charity cricket match at Lord's, and he brought his family with him. And he stayed overnight. And he went to check into his hotel, big swish place on Russell Square, literally a stone's throw from my office, and said, I've got a reservation, I'm Leary Constantine, I'd like to check in, please. The receptionist said, I'm very sorry, sir, I see you have a reservation. We won't be allowed to let you stay here tonight. Very embarrassing discussion unfolded. What transpired, the problem was, white American army officers stationed in the Imperial Hotel refused to let the hotel admit Leary Constantine. One small anecdote that demonstrates a much bigger phenomenon that British historians and, dare I say, the British public haven't really even begun to get our heads around. The US Army brought a segregated army over to British shores in 1942 and 1943, and it posed a series of profound dilemmas to the British government as to what they would do. And to cut a long story short, the goal of winning the war took precedence over challenging segregated practices. But, and here's the crucial bit, that's kind of unsurprising, the role of people like Constantine mattered. Constantine did not accept this. He sued the hotel, and eventually he won. It became one of the first landmark cases that led to the passage of Britain's own Race Relations Act. Constantine, I don't know if you know, became the first black member of the House of Lords.